In 1937, Josephine Baker signed a document that made her legally French. She was 31 years old. She was also, at that moment, the highest-paid entertainer in Europe, the most photographed woman on the continent, a decorated performer who had appeared before royalty and filled every theater she had ever entered. None of that had been enough to earn her a meal at a restaurant in her own country. None of it had been enough to stop a New York newspaper from calling her a wench in print. None of it had been enough to make America see her as anything other than what it had decided she was before she was old enough to understand what it had decided. Baker had left St. Louis at 19 and found in Paris a level of freedom America had never offered her. She later spoke openly about fleeing the terror of racial discrimination. She did not hide the reason, did not dress it in diplomatic language, did not pretend the decision had been difficult in the way that comfortable decisions are difficult. But renouncing her citizenship was more than a protest against one humiliating incident. It was the final legal break between Baker and the country that had shaped her earliest fears, that had burned her neighborhood when she was 11 years old, that had told her as a child not to kiss the baby, and that had responded to a decade of extraordinary achievement by calling her names in its most prestigious newspaper. What had America done to make one of its most famous daughters decide that she no longer wanted to belong to it? She was born Freda Josephine MacDonald on June 3, 1906, into poverty, into a struggling African-American family that had limited financial resources in every sense those words can carry. Her mother, Carrie MacDonald, was a washerwoman. Her father, Eddie Carson, was a vaudeville drummer who did not stay. In fact, she was often hungry growing up and lived without indoor plumbing. There was much discussion, even at the time, as to whether Eddie Carson was in fact her biological father, but she certainly lived with the consequences of his absence, which included a mother who found it difficult to look at her eldest daughter without seeing the face of the man who had left. Josephine's frustrated mother took her emotions out on Josephine, who, she said, looked like her father. This is the foundation, not the banana skirt, not the Folies Bergère, not the spy games and the chateau and the Legion of Honor. The foundation is a girl who looked like the man who left, raised by a woman who could not stop seeing him every time she looked at her daughter's face. She grew up cleaning houses and babysitting for wealthy white families who reminded her to be sure not to kiss the baby. She absorbed these instructions with the particular intelligence of a child who understands that survival requires attention to the rules others make, even when, especially when, those rules are designed to remind you of your position. She was not the baby. She would never be the baby. She was the girl who handled the baby and was told, casually, as an afterthought, not to let her lips touch it. The early life of Josephine Baker was defined by this kind of quiet institutional cruelty, the kind that doesn't announce itself as cruelty, the kind that presents itself as simple common sense, as the natural order of things, as instructions for a child who needs to understand how the world works. She dropped out of school when she was 12. She was married for the first time at 13 to a man named Willie Wells, a union that ended almost immediately. She married again at 15 to Will Baker, whose last name she kept long after the marriage dissolved, not out of sentiment, but because it was useful, because it was a new identity assembled from whatever materials happened to be at hand. She had that quality throughout her entire life, the ability to construct herself from available scraps, to become exactly what a given moment required, which is partly what made her such a devastatingly effective intelligence agent 20 years later, and partly what made her such an elusive subject for anyone who wanted a definitive answer about who she really was beneath the performances. She understood, even as a child, that the world she inhabited was not particularly interested in who she really was. St. Louis, in the early 20th century, was not simply a segregated city. It was a city that had recently been convulsed by some of the worst racial violence in American history. The East St. Louis race riots of 1917, which occurred when Baker was 11 years old, left dozens of Black Americans dead and thousands homeless. Their neighborhoods burned by mobs while police and National Guard troops stood watching or participated. She saw this. She was old enough to understand what she saw. And what she understood was that the country she had been born into was capable not merely of humiliating Black people, but of destroying them, openly, with the tacit or explicit approval of its institutions. And that this destruction was not an aberration, but a feature, not a failure of the system, but one of its reliable outputs. She left for Paris at 19. In 1925, she exploded onto the scene in La Revue Negre, becoming a star on opening night. Her vibrant dancing and her shocking costumes, including the famous costume of 16 bananas strung into a skirt, appealed to the French, who were obsessed with American jazz culture and with what they called the exotic. The reception she received there was extraordinary by any measure, though it is worth pausing over the nature of that reception, because Paris did not love Josephine Baker because it had transcended racism. It loved her in part through a complicated lens of exoticism that she learned to inhabit, to perform, and ultimately to subvert. The banana skirt was not simply an expression of liberation. It was a negotiation with the desires of an audience that wanted something primitive and spectacular. And Baker, who had learned as a child to give people what they needed in order to survive, gave it to them while secretly becoming, in the process, the most powerful woman in European entertainment. By 1927, she earned more than any entertainer in Europe. She was photographed more than any other woman on the continent, rivaling Gloria Swanson and Mary Pickford as the most photographed woman in the world. She had a pet cheetah named Chiquita, who accompanied her on a leash to performances. She had a chateau in the French countryside. She had fans who dyed their skin in imitation of hers, who called the fashionable light brown complexion café au lait, and meant it as the highest compliment. This was, in its way, no less strange than what she had left behind. But it was strangeness she could live inside, strangeness that paid her rather than punishing her. She appeared in films. She performed for European royalty. She spoke French fluently, with the kind of fluency that comes from genuine immersion in a language and a culture. She was, by any reasonable accounting, one of the most successful human beings alive. And then she went back. In 1936, over a decade after she had left, Josephine Baker returned to the United States to perform in the Ziegfeld Follies, the most prestigious revue in American show business, alongside Fanny Brice and Bob Hope. She had been invited. She had top billing. She was, at this point, the most famous entertainer in Europe. And she harbored the reasonable expectation that this fame would translate into the kind of reception that her decade of achievement warranted. What she received instead was something that she spent the rest of her life trying to describe, and that the public record captures only in fragments that still manage to convey the full force of the injury. American audiences rejected the idea of a Black woman with so much sophistication and power. The American press was ruthless in their criticism. The New York Times, the newspaper of record, the institution that American journalism held up as its standard of taste and seriousness, called her a Negro wench. The words are important to dwell on, not because they are surprising in historical context, but because of what they reveal about the specific nature of what America found intolerable about Josephine Baker at that moment. It was not simply her blackness. It was her sophistication alongside her blackness. It was the combination of these two things that the American press, the American public, and the American entertainment industry found genuinely, viscerally offensive. A Black woman who spoke French, who carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to being celebrated, who did not perform deference, who had apparently forgotten the instructions she had been given as a child about not kissing the baby. This was the thing that could not be accommodated. She performed with 4 white men in one of her sets, which the press latched onto as inappropriate. Her film, Princess Tom Tom, was banned outright in the United States because of its portrayal of Josephine Baker alongside many white co-stars. In her personal encounters during that tour, she was refused service at clubs and restaurants. She was barred from hotels. She recounted one incident in which a white woman spat on her. And her response, she did not react because in her words, it was not the woman's fault she had been raised that way, tells you everything about the exhausting, practiced restraint that black public figures in Jim Crow America were required to maintain simply in order to continue existing in public spaces. The rage had to go somewhere. Baker had been putting it somewhere since she was 11 years old. The show failed. When Fanny Brice fell ill and the review was temporarily postponed, Baker took the opportunity to break her contract. She fled to Paris, embarrassed, heartbroken, and disgraced by a country that was incapable of seeing her as a complete human being. She had not gone to the United States expecting miracles. She had gone hoping, perhaps, that a decade of achievement at the highest level might have earned her something. What she found was that it had earned her nothing that mattered, that the calculus by which she was judged in the country of her birth had not shifted even slightly, that all the crowns and curtain calls and café au lait comparisons evaporated the moment she stood on American soil, leaving behind only the girl from St. Louis who was not supposed to kiss the baby. She returned to Europe and married Jean Lion, a French sugar broker, in 1937. When she married a French citizen, French and American laws at the time did not allow a woman to be a dual national, and Baker lost her American citizenship. There are 2 ways to read this fact. One version presents it as something that simply happened to her, a legal consequence of marriage that she may not have fully anticipated. The other version, and the one that feels more consistent with everything else we know about her, is that she understood perfectly what she was doing, that the marriage was both genuine and convenient, that she knew the citizenship question would resolve itself in a particular direction, and that she had decided quietly, without a public announcement, without the kind of dramatic declaration that the newspapers might have seized upon, that this was acceptable to her. She had seen enough. She was done. She never said this in precisely these terms. The reason she never told it in public is that the true account is not the clean, simple story of a woman fleeing obvious bigotry. The true account is more complicated, more damning both of America and of the international stage she had chosen. And it involves not just racism, but the intersection of racism with sexism, with nationalist law, with intelligence work, with McCarthyism, with the private grief of a woman who could not have biological children, with a domestic experiment that ultimately broke her financially, and with a lifelong, painful, unresolved ambivalence about the country she had left that persisted even after she was no longer legally its citizen. Because Baker never stopped caring about the United States. This is the detail that complicates the simple narrative of exile. She did not leave and forget. She left and spent the next 4 decades trying to hold America accountable to its own stated principles, returning to it again and again, fighting for it from the outside with a ferocity that makes sense only if you understand that she had not stopped wanting to be loved by it. The anger and the love were not opposites. They were the same thing. When France fell to Nazi Germany in 1940, Baker made a choice that was, on one level, straightforward, and, on another level, the most revealing thing about who she was beneath all the performances. She became a spy. She had been recruited by Jacques Abté, the head of French military intelligence, in 1939, as war drums reverberated across Europe. Abté typically sought out men who could travel incognito. Nothing about what he found in Baker was typical. She was the most famous woman in France, immediately recognizable anywhere she went. And she told him that the French people had given her everything, and that she was ready to give them her life. He could use her as he wished. She wrote secrets on her hands and arms in invisible ink. She smuggled documents in her lingerie. She attended diplomatic parties at the Italian and Japanese embassies, charming officials while gathering intelligence about Axis powers and troop movements, showing no fear of being caught. Nobody would think she was a spy, she said with a laugh when warned of the danger. And she was right. The same qualities that made her irresistible as a performer, her warmth, her humor, her extraordinary capacity to make people feel seen and appreciated, made her devastatingly effective as an intelligence asset. She concealed sensitive documents in her sheet music as she traveled on performance tours across Europe. She met with resistance sympathizers. She ferried photographs and coded messages. Her French country home became a base of operations for the resistance, with a radio transmitter installed in one of its towers to allow contact with Britain, and weapons stored in her cellar. When acute peritonitis nearly killed her in 1941, she continued coordinating resistance efforts from her hospital bed. When the Nazis searched her home, she had already moved the most sensitive materials. When she needed to transport critical intelligence to free French forces in London, she and Abti devised a cover that was almost outrageously elegant. A glamorous performance tour through South America and neutral countries, during which Baker, draped in furs and surrounded by the accoutrements of international stardom, charmed Axis diplomats at every stop, while smuggling vital photographs and classified documents in her costumes. France honored her. She received the Croix de Guerre. She received the Légion d'honneur, France's highest military honor. She was made a sub-lieutenant in the Women's Auxiliary of the French Air Force. These were not honorary gestures. They were recognition of genuine service at genuine personal risk, the kind of risk that most people, given the choice, sensibly choose not to take. The country she had risked her life to fight beside, France, had given her honors, a chateau, and the kind of public love that she had crossed an ocean to find. The country that had refused to serve her dinner and called her a wench in its newspaper of record had given her, in the years since, precisely nothing. She was a French citizen. She had chosen correctly. The choice seemed settled. And then the United States made it complicated again. In the early 1950s, Baker returned to America to perform. She had decided that she could use her international fame to fight for civil rights in the country she had left, and she was determined to do it on her own terms. She refused to perform at any venue that did not allow integrated audiences. She was denied contracts at 39 establishments in the United States because of this demand. She made the demand anyway. The NAACP recognized her efforts and her opposition against segregation and discrimination. She was becoming, in her 50s, a different kind of force. Not just an entertainer, but a political figure. A woman whose refusal to accept the terms of American racism had a particular weight because she had somewhere else to be, because she had shown that the alternative existed. On October 16, 1951, she entered New York's Stork Club, one of the most exclusive and fashionable night spots in the city, for dinner. She was served drinks, but not food. She waited. The service never came. Angry words were exchanged. She left. Sitting nearby at the time, saying nothing, was Walter Winchell, the most powerful gossip columnist in America, a man who reached tens of millions of readers and listeners, a man who had once been her friend. He had watched the entire incident without intervening. Baker named him publicly as a witness who had failed to act. She filed a police report. She called her lawyer. She called the NAACP. What happened next revealed something important about the American establishment's tolerance for criticism, even from someone who had just spent years risking her life fighting fascism. Winchell retaliated. In a series of columns and broadcasts, he accused Baker of communist sympathies, a charge that, in the era of Joseph McCarthy, was not merely an insult but a weapon. He dubbed her Josephine Baker. He dredged up a years-old quote in which she had said something mildly positive about Mussolini, a quote that predated Mussolini's alliance with Hitler by several years, a distinction Winchell chose not to make. He mocked her war record. He questioned her patriotism, the patriotism of a woman who had, in fact, risked her life and very nearly lost it in service of her adopted country, while the United States was still trying to decide whether she deserved to order dinner in a New York restaurant. The FBI, which had once been the recipient of intelligence that Baker had gathered on behalf of the French resistance, opened a bureau dossier on her. Her scheduled shows were canceled. American media outlets distanced themselves. Her tour collapsed. The State Department terminated her work visa. She was told, effectively, that she was no longer welcome in the country that had produced her, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she had insisted, publicly, on being treated as a human being, and a man with a column had decided to punish her for the inconvenience. This is the part of the story that Baker did not tell cleanly in public, and the reason is not hard to understand. The full account requires acknowledging that she had gone back to America hoping for something, not just hoping to help the civil rights movement, but hoping still, at some level, for the thing she had wanted as a child performing on the streets of St. Louis for nickels and dimes. She wanted to be seen. She wanted America to see her. And America, through Walter Winchell and the FBI and the State Department and the Stork Club, had looked directly at her and denied her again. The passport she had given up was not simply a document she had traded for a French marriage certificate. It was a relationship she had ended because the relationship was making her sick. And then she had tried, gently, to resume it, and had been reminded of exactly why she had ended it. She was barred from the United States for 9 years. During those 9 years, and the years that followed, she threw herself into the project that would define the second half of her life, and ultimately destroy her finances. She had purchased a Renaissance chateau called Les Milandes in the Dordogne region of France. Starting in 1953, she began adopting children. Not 1 or 2, but 12, from Japan, Korea, Finland, Colombia, France, Algeria, the Ivory Coast, Venezuela, Morocco, and Israel. She called them the Rainbow Tribe. She chose children of different races and religions deliberately. She had electricity and running water installed throughout the surrounding village, which she had also purchased. She organized the first bus stops in the area. She rebuilt not just a chateau, but an entire community. She wanted to prove something. The experiment in racial harmony that she had risked her life to fight for during the war would now play out in the gardens and rooms of her Renaissance estate. She transformed Les Milandes into a tourist attraction, a full theme park, in effect, with rides for children, a cafe, a restaurant serving Périgord cuisine, a jazz club, a motel for overnight visitors, and a wax museum called Jarama that displayed pivotal moments from Baker's life. The main attraction was the Rainbow Tribe themselves. Visitors watched the children play together in the gardens, saw them perform, and observed this multicultural family living together in harmony. Baker charged admission to help support the enormous expense of maintaining a Renaissance chateau and raising 12 children with an enormous staff. The children were brought up in accordance with their heritage and the religions that Baker assigned to them. One was Buddhist, one Protestant, one animist, one Jewish, and so forth. Her fourth husband, the French orchestra leader Joe Baillon, wrote the children a universal prayer of brotherhood. Baker always spoke of her family in interviews, of the humanist philosophy she practiced every day. She said there was no point in adopting children of every color to keep them away from everyone else. They had to be made visible so that people could see it was possible, that children from different races, raised together as siblings, have no animosity, that racial hate is not natural, but an invention by mankind. This was not theater, or rather, It was theater in the way that all of Baker's major life choices were theater. Conscious, deliberate, performed for an audience because she believed that the audience needed to see it. She had spent her entire career understanding that visibility was itself a political act, that being seen doing something changes what people believe is possible. The Rainbow Tribe was the same argument she had made in the Banana Skirt and in the Resistance and in the Stork Club incident, the argument that the world could be different from what it was, that the differences between people that others used as weapons could be lived with and through and past. It cost her everything. Too generous and certainly too naive, she was useless at managing a business. In addition to a tendency to overspend, she was defrauded by unscrupulous contractors, paying the same bills many times over. Her limitless generosity pushed her into heavy debt. Jo Bouillon eventually left, unable to contain the increasingly unrealistic financial ambitions that Baker's vision required. The chateau came close to being sold on several occasions. Baker refused proposals to make a film about her children. They were there to represent an ideal, she said, not to be turned into performing monkeys. She continued to perform, touring relentlessly to generate money that went immediately into the black hole of Les Milan's operating costs and the needs of 12 children. In 1969, she was evicted. The chateau was sold to pay her debts. She was found sitting on the front steps, refusing to leave by journalists and photographers who captured the image of a 63-year-old woman who had been one of the most celebrated people in the world, sitting on the steps of the home she had built, unable to accept that it was gone. Her friend, Princess Grace of Monaco, gave her an apartment to live in with her children, and later a villa on the Riviera. Baker moved the Rainbow Tribe to Monaco. She kept performing. She had no choice. She had 12 children and no savings. But she also performed because it was what she did, because the stage was the one place where the contradictions of her life resolved themselves temporarily into something coherent, where she was not a black woman from St. Louis who had been denied dinner, not a decorated war hero whose patriotism had been questioned by a gossip columnist, not a mother who had lost her chateau, but simply Josephine, a force of nature in sequins and feathers, whose voice and body could silence a room. In 1963, she appeared at the March on Washington alongside Martin Luther King Jr. She was one of the few women allowed to speak. She was wearing her French resistance uniform with her medals, and she told the crowd something that she had been building toward her whole life, something that was both a confession and an accusation. I have walked into the palaces of kings and queens and into the houses of presidents, and much more, but I could not walk into a hotel in America and get a cup of coffee, and that made me mad. The speech was not simply anger. It was a document of the distance between what America claimed to be and what it had been to her specifically, a record of the gap between the promise and the performance, offered by someone who had spent her entire life performing the distance between those two things. In 1973, she performed at Carnegie Hall in New York. She was 67 years old, and she had been through bankruptcy, illness, eviction, and exile. The audience gave her a standing ovation. She wept openly on stage. The woman who had learned not to show her feelings in the presence of people who had power over her. The child who had watched her neighborhood burn and understood that survival required a certain careful management of visible emotion, stood in front of an audience in the city that had refused to serve her dinner 22 years earlier and cried. The show was a huge success and marked her comeback to the stage. She died in Paris on April 12, 1975, of a cerebral hemorrhage, 4 days after the opening of a new show that had received rapturous reviews. France gave her a state funeral with military honors. She was the first American woman to receive that honor. She was buried in Monaco, the country that had called her a wench in its newspaper of record, that had opened an FBI file on her, that had revoked her visa because she had objected to being refused a stake, issued no comparable tribute. She was inducted into the Pantheon in 2021, the first American woman and the first performer to receive France's highest posthumous honor. Emmanuel Macron said that while she had been born American, deep down, there was no one more French than her. It is the kind of sentence that sounds like a compliment, and is, in fact, a description of an irony so large and so painful that it almost requires the neutralizing frame of official ceremony to be stated out loud. She was born American. She was made French by the accumulated weight of what America had done to her and refused to do for her. She did not choose France. America chose for her, again and again, in ways large and small, over decades, with a consistency that left her no alternative that was not also a form of slow self-destruction. The reason she never told this in public, not in these terms, not with this specificity, is that telling it this way requires a kind of vulnerability that Baker, who had been managing other people's perceptions of her since she was a child, who looked like the man who left, was constitutionally unable to perform in public. To say I loved this country and it would not love me back. To say I tried and each time I tried, it spat on me and called me a wench and opened a file on me. To say that the passport I gave up was not simply a document, but a piece of myself that I surrendered. Because continuing to hold it was costing me something I could not afford to keep paying. This is not the kind of statement that a black woman who had survived what Baker had survived would make in front of a camera, in front of a reporter, in front of an audience that included the institutions and individuals responsible for what she was describing. She said instead, with perfect precision, and just enough compression to let the listener decide how much they wanted to understand. I have two loves, my country and Paris. It is one of the most famous things she ever said. It is also, if you know what you are listening for, one of the saddest. The passport she gave up was not given up in triumph. It was given up in exhaustion, in grief, in the quiet fury of a woman who had tried everything available to her and had been told, each time, that it was not enough, that she was not enough, that no amount of excellence or achievement or sacrifice could purchase the basic recognition she was asking for. She did not announce this. She did not make a speech. She married a Frenchman, signed the papers, and became, in the eyes of the law, what she had been in practice for over a decade, a French woman, without legal connection to the country that had formed her, damaged her, and ultimately refused to see her. The thing she never said in public is that it was not a victory. The clean version, she chose France, France chose her, she was free, is the version of the story that can be told in a documentary, in a tribute at the Pantheon, in the kind of article that ends with a photograph of medals and honors. The true version is messier and more human and more devastating, and it goes something like this. She left because she had to. She tried to come back because she couldn't stop caring. She was rejected again. She built a family and a dream and lost them both. She kept performing until she died, and she never stopped being from St. Louis, never stopped being the child who was told not to kiss the baby, never stopped hoping that the country which had produced her might someday understand what it had thrown away. It did not understand during her lifetime. It gave her instead a standing ovation in 1973, 22 years after it had opened a file on her for daring to object to being refused dinner. The ovation was real. The tears she wept were real. And the distance between those two facts, the ovation and the file, the tears and the decades between them, is the distance that no passport, French or American, could ever fully close.